By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how to create your own custom text-to-speech model using a combination of both OpenAI and Bubble. In our example today, we'll allow users to type in text they'd like to be spoken, then give them the option to choose their very own style of AI voice. We'll then send that text over to OpenAI, where it'll generate an audio file that we can store in our Bubble database. Now, if you don't have any coding experience, please do not stress. You don't need to know how to code to follow this video. Instead, I'll be holding your hand as I walk you through the exact step-by-step instructions that you need to follow. Look, by this point, I've already said enough. Let's just jump right into it and we can get started. Within my tutorial today, the very first thing I want to do before I explain how you can build anything and connect any APIs is just show you a real-world example of what we're going to be building. So I've gone ahead and I've prepared this dummy application for us today known as Speechify. Now look, I apologize if you're watching this and you do have a startup called Speechify. I didn't intend to copy you, but I'm pretty sure any startup name generator is most likely going to land on something like this. So please don't sue me. But nonetheless, let's jump into this demo. So with Speechify, what you're able to do is add in some text, choose an AI voice, and have that generate an audio file. And for my audio file today, what I'm going to do is recreate my favorite saying ever. So I'm going to paste this text in, choose a voice. I'm going to choose Nova. I'm going to generate this audio here. It's going to connect with OpenAI. It's going to turn that text into audio. And if I scroll on down, I can now play this audio clip.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct, but it's wordy and hard to read. It undermines the writer's message, and the word choice is bland.
And look, it's not quite the same as the real-world Grammarly ad, but it's not too bad. So if this is the kind of application or feature you want to build out within your own app, this is the exact tutorial for you. So what I want to do from here is jump into a separate browser and just open up a checklist of everything I'm going to cover within this particular video. Now, inside of this checklist, it has all of the details that we need to follow. So literally every single step along the way. Now, I'll be sure to include a link to this checklist in the description of this video, so that way you can also make a copy and follow along as I tick items off. Now, I personally just use a tool called Notion for my checklists. It's just a great note-taking and documentation tool, and I pretty much run my entire life out of it. But the first thing I want to do on my list, aside from showing you a demo of our product, is connect our API. So today we're going to be leveraging a tool from OpenAI, which is their text-to-speech model. Now, in order to send that text from our Bubble app through to OpenAI, where it's going to turn that into speech or audio, what we need to do is create a connection between both of these platforms. And that is the purpose of an API. Now, if you are brand new to Bubble, I completely understand that the concept of APIs can seem a little bit overwhelming. But look, I assure you, you don't need any coding experience to be able to do this. In fact, if a dummy like myself can figure it out, I'm incredibly confident that you'll be able to follow along with my steps. And look, the beautiful thing about working with APIs in this day and age is that if you run into any issues along the way, you can always troubleshoot things using ChatGPT itself. It is an incredibly helpful resource. But for our tutorial today, we're going to jump straight into a brand new Bubble editor, and we're going to head over to our plugins tab, because before we build anything out, what we need to do is create that API, as I mentioned. But before we can create that API, we need to install a plugin which allows us to connect and create APIs inside of our application. So we're going to choose to add a new plugin, and right at the top here, we're going to install the API Connect plugin, which of course is a free plugin built by Bubble. I'm then going to choose to close my plugin library, and we're going to now add our very first API. Now, for this API, I'm going to call this the service that we're going to connect with. So this, of course, will be OpenAI. And then this is where all of the real work is going to start. So in order to set up and configure our API correctly today, we just need to reference some documentation written by OpenAI, which just tells us exactly how to do that. Now look, I've included a link to that documentation within my Notion checklist. So you'll see here down on my checklist, I've got this little link. And when you click on this, it's going to take us to their text-to-speech model. And this includes all of these steps that we need to follow. Now, particularly what I'm interested in finding right now is the quick start instructions. So this little bit of code here contains absolutely everything we need. And if you're viewing this, I'd always recommend making sure it's set as the curl option. The curl option can easily be interpreted by Bubble. Although today we are going to be manually connecting this with Bubble, just so that way I can teach you a bunch of core lessons along the way. But if for some reason this is set to Python or even Node, please just make sure it's set as the curl option. And before I even reference any of this code here, what we need to do is actually create an API key. And if you're not familiar with API keys, they're just a way of connecting two particular services. So let's say we've got our Bubble app over here and OpenAI over here. An API allows these two platforms to send and receive information between each other. And an API key, as the name would suggest, is kind of like a key that opens the door so these two platforms can see and verify information between each other. Now, if you haven't yet created an OpenAI account, this is where you'll need to do that. And once you've created a free account, you'll need to create your very first API key. And where you can do that is by selecting on the API keys menu on the side option here. That's going to then open up a separate page. And as you'll see, I've already created two API keys myself. But if you have none here, you'll need to create a new secret key. Another thing I should point out is that although OpenAI does provide you with some free credits to get started, to experiment with some of their models, I would recommend purchasing some credits to add to your account. Even if it's something like $5 to $10, it's just going to enable you to do a lot more. But let's say from here, you've taken the time to pause this tutorial and you've created your first API key. What you'll need to do is jump into Bubble and now add that into this API. And how can we do that? Under the authentication field here, what we're going to do is select the option known as private key in header. Now, how do I know to select that option? Look, in 90% of scenarios, whenever you're connecting an API, this is going to be the way you're going to authenticate it. And first of all, I should say, what on earth is authentication? Authentication is just a way for OpenAI to verify that when your Bubble app sends a request to its service, it is in fact your app. It's not some random app that someone else has created pretending to be your app. It is your app. And that kind of goes along with the analogy of having an API key. So it's kind of like the key that opens the door. Now, what you might have noticed here is that when we select the option to add a private key in our header, it automatically adds in a key name known as authorization. So this is where we need to add the value of our authorization API key. And we're going to add that in this value field. And in this field, you will need to paste in your API key. But before you do that, you'll just need to type in the word bearer with a capital B followed by a space. And then from here, you can paste in your API key. Now, once again, why on earth do you need to add bearer into this? Look, it's a pretty common configuration whenever you're using any API. It just says that you are the bearer of this API key, so you are the owner. If we were to also look at the original OpenAI documentation, what you'll see under this header field here, so this first H, is that we need to create an authorization for this API, which is exactly where that authorization text came from. And then as you'll see, they've given you an example of how you should paste in your API key. So you can see there's the word bearer followed by a space, and then it tells you to add in your own OpenAI key, which is exactly what we just did. So if you want to double check your formatting, this is where you can discover how to do that. Now, the other thing you might notice is that there's another header field here. And back in Bubble, you have the option to add multiple different header values. But I'm not going to do this on my overall API here. Instead, I'm going to do that when I create a separate API call within my overall API. And the reason why I personally like to do that is because if we look at the value of this header, it's just requesting a content type. And it actually lays out the value that we need to paste in for this particular API service. And that is the application/JSON. So that is just the type of content that we need to send through to this API service. Now, there is a specific reason why I'm not going to add this to my overall API. If you add it to your overall API, it automatically applies that setting to any particular API calls within that. And now, while that's fine for my authorization, because at the top level for my overall API, I'm just creating that successful connection. But not every API call is going to be in the same content format. And so what do I mean by that? Look, OpenAI has a bunch of different services. There's text generation, image generation, speech to text, text to speech, and the list just goes on. And look, each one of those services has its own specific content type. So some might request text, others might request JSON, others might request actual files. So if you're uploading an audio file, for example. And so that's why I like to add that header on my individual API calls. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. So within our overall API here, which is the OpenAI API, what we're going to do is create our first call. And a call is, as the name would suggest, a bit of information that you're going to call to the end API. So it's kind of like the action you're going to perform within the API. Now look, I'm going to expand this here. And the first thing I'd like to do is give this API call a name. And I'm going to call it text to speech because that's exactly what we're going to do. Then from here, we're just going to need to make a few minor tweaks to some of these settings in the drop-down menus. So when it comes to APIs, you'll notice that there's two options you can reference. There's something known as data or there's an action. Now with APIs, if you're connecting to a third-party service, you're most likely going to want to receive data or send data to it. So if you use an API call as data, that means you're receiving data. So you might use that for an application where you're displaying things like stock or share prices or the price of crypto, because you're constantly just pulling information from a service and displaying it. And by that, I just mean you're not using anything in an actual workflow. Whereas with the action option here, what that means is that you want to perform an action to this API. So you want to send something to that API service and you want it to do something, which is exactly what we want to do today. We want to send the API text and then receive an audio file. So I'm going to select the action option. For the data type, so this is the thing that I'm going to receive back from the API service. I want this to be a file because it's going to be an audio file. And then from here, what I need to do is add in the URL of this specific API endpoint. And so if we jump back to our documentation, what you'll see is right at the top of this curl here, there is in fact a URL. So this is the address where this API service lives on the internet. And so within this API call, what I essentially want to do is write a letter to this API service and say, here's a bunch of text, I'll post it to you. It's going to go to your home address, which is this URL here. When you receive this letter, I want you to read this text and I want you to turn it into an audio file and then send that back to me. And so what we need to do is grab that address. So I'm going to copy that URL, jump back into Bubble here, paste that in this field, but we also need to update this option here to be the post option. Because as I said, back to my address analogy, we're posting a letter to this address. So I need to select the post option. And then if we keep moving down our API call, you'll now see the option to add in a custom header value. Now this is where we're going to add that second header value that is the content type, because I just want to reference the specific content type for this specific API call. So what we need to do is copy the word content type, exactly how it's spelled here. We'll jump back into Bubble, we'll add a new header, and for the key name here, I'm going to paste in that word that we just copied. Then for the value, I'm going to paste in the value that OpenAI has provided for us. So that is the application/JSON. I'll jump into Bubble and paste that in. I'm also just going to unselect this option that this header should be private, just so that way it doesn't have any issues sending this information through to OpenAI. And now below this is where we need to add in our parameters. And look, this is probably the most confusing or overwhelming thing when it comes to working with APIs. But look, I'm going to explain it in simple terms for you. So a parameter in layman's terms is just a way of saying what type of information you're going to send through to this API. So in our example today, there's going to be a few little bits of information we need to send through. We obviously need to send through our text that we then want turned into audio. We need to tell OpenAI which model it should use to actually convert that text into audio. And then we want to choose which AI voice we should use for that audio generation. And so if we just jump back to our OpenAI documentation, what you'll see is that under both of our header values, we have this D value here. And within this, these are all of our parameters. So there's three. There's the model. So that's the AI model that we need to reference. There's the input, which as I said is our text, and then there's the voice. So what style of voice do we want on this audio file? Now all we need to do is copy across this exact value once again. And so I'm just going to copy in between the little quote marks here. So I'm going to grab the bracket all the way down to the second bracket, make a copy of that, jump back into Bubble, and within our JSON field here, I'm just going to paste this in. Now the reason why this is probably the most confusing part about working with APIs is because this is kind of structured like actual code. But look, please just try and avoid the squiggly brackets and all of the quotation marks. I assure you it's nothing too complex. In fact, if we were to run this API right now, it would work. So it would send through this information saying, this is the exact model I want to use. It's the TTS1, so text to speech 1, which is just the name that OpenAI gives to that model. Then it would turn this text into speech. So it would say, today is a wonderful day to build something people love. And it would use the voice known as Alloy, which if we just jump back to the documentation page, you'll see here, there's a bunch of different voice options that you can use. So I'd recommend playing around with these to see which one you like. but Alloy is the name of the very first choice. So this would in fact work, but every single time you run this API, it's going to use this exact text here because this is static. If you're familiar with Bubble, the one thing you might know is the term dynamic. And so what we want to do today is allow these fields to be dynamic. So when it comes to the input, I want to obviously allow users to type in their own text, and then I want to dynamically send that text through with each API call. Right now, the only thing I'm going to make dynamic is the input text. I'm not going to worry about the voice right now, although I will come back to that later on. So in order to make this dynamic, what I need to do is just remove all of this static text between my two quotations. And to create a dynamic field in Bubble, you just need to add the open bracket and then type in the name of your parameter. Now look, I'm just going to call mine text today because this is where text is going to go. It's as simple as that. And as you'll see, it's just going to mark that up as green, and then it's going to create a parameter here. So now essentially what we've done is we've told Bubble that, hey, this text field is actually going to be dynamic. We're going to constantly change the text that we feed it. And for the value of that, we'll be able to insert dynamic data when we run a workflow. But when you're trying to run a preview of this API call, you will just need to type in a bit of a test value. So I could just say this is test text. And similar to our headers, I'm just going to unselect that this should be private. And just like that, that is absolutely everything we need to set up when it comes to this API call for now. So to finalize this, we need to select this option to initialize this call. What it's then going to do is run a test of this with this information that we've just typed in. And if I preview this,
this is test text.
What you'll see is that it's going to open up a separate tab in my browser where it's displaying that audio file that it's just generated from my test text. So that means that our API is working perfectly. We of course just now need to integrate this inside of our actual Bubble app. But look, before we do that, what I want to do is just jump back to my Notion checklist and quickly tick off that we've finished building out everything we need to connect our initial API call. So we've taken the time to look through the OpenAI documentation. We made a few tweaks to the configurations of the API call. We copied across all of the parameters that OpenAI provided us. And then we created a dynamic parameter of our own for the text field. And then we ran a preview of that API. So we initialized it and it was successful. Now, one thing I might note is that sometimes you might get an error message when you go to initialize your call that might say you need to purchase more credits. What that essentially just means is that your API is not broken. You just need to go into OpenAI, add your billing information, and buy some credits because your account will expire. You don't get them free forever. So please just take the time to make sure you do that if you see that error message. Don't be that person who comments on my YouTube video saying that it's broken. It's not. You just need to add your credit card, please. But look, from here, what I want to focus on is now just how I built out my application so we can incorporate this API into our Bubble app. And this is where things get super exciting and sexy. No one likes to have fun building out boring APIs. We all just want to build out the cool features inside of Bubble. So you know what I say? Let's get right to it. If we jump over to my Bubble editor, I'm going to jump to my design tab and open up a page that I've already created. Now, there's a couple of things I just want to quickly walk you through. First of all, how I've set this page up, then how I've set my database up, and then of course, how I've set my workflows up. So on this page, things are pretty basic. I don't have too much happening. I've obviously got some text elements. I've got a multi-line input field here where a user can type in their text. And then I've got a drop-down menu which allows someone to select from an AI voice. Now, please don't worry about that right now. We are going to touch base on that in a moment. I then obviously have a button which when clicked is going to run a workflow so we can send that information to OpenAI. But if we scroll on down, I also have a repeating group on my page. So if I double click on this repeating group is just displaying a data type that I've called AI audio. So if we now just digress and open up my data tab, you'll see I have a data type that I've created for the sake of this tutorial called AI audio. And within this, I only have two data fields. There's first of all, the audio file, which is a file type. And then there's my input text, which is a text type. Now, of course, your database might look a little bit different. If, for instance, if you're building a blogging platform and you want to be able to turn someone's blog into an audiobook or something, all you'd need to do is add these two fields under your relevant data type. But I just wanted to quickly show you how I've set things up. Back in my design tab though, for this repeating group, as I mentioned, the type of content is just my AI audio. And for the data source, I'm just performing a search for all of the AI audio inside of my database. Then of course, inside of this repeating group, I've just added a text element which displays the input text. And then beside this, what I've done is I've actually added in a HTML audio player. Now, this is actually probably the most confusing thing about this tutorial, particularly if you don't have any experience with things like HTML, CSS, or code. And look, I don't really either, but it is pretty straightforward to build out. When it comes to creating an audio player, look, I'm sure there are plenty of great plugins, some free, some paid. But in my opinion, the easiest way to build this out is just by adding in some HTML onto your page. So back over in my Notion checklist, you'll see that down the page, I've actually added in a link here, which when you click on this, it's going to take you through to a site that actually displays some HTML code. Now, all you have to do is copy and paste this HTML onto your Bubble app, and it will automatically add and format an audio player for you. It truly is as simple as that. So I'm going to show you exactly how to do that, because the last thing I want is to leave you asking more questions by the end of this tutorial. So what we're going to do is just highlight all of this HTML. We're going to jump back to our Bubble editor. And then under our visual elements, all you need to do is grab a HTML element, add this into your repeating group, and paste in that HTML. Now, the only other thing you'll need to do here is swap out the example audio file that this HTML has provided with the name of your own audio file. So you'll see here under the source, there's an example between the two quotation marks, which is just horse.ogg, and then there's horse.mp3. So instead of playing this default file, which is what I assume to be a horse neighing, if that's what you call it, what we're going to do is swap that out with our own audio file. And if you remember, in our database, we have an audio file under our AI audio data type. So what we need to do is just grab the text here, which is horse.ogg, and just remove that static text. And inside the quotation marks, we're going to insert dynamic data, and we're just going to reference the current cell's AI audio, the audio file, the URL of that audio file. So it's going to play that. I'll then do the exact same thing for where it says horse.mp3. I'm going to swap that out. So I'll remove the static text, insert dynamic data, and display the current cell's AI audio. Once again, it's audio file, the URL of that file. And that's all you'll need to change. I know that looks a little confusing, but trust me, it's going to format that as an audio player, as you can already see. Now look, I'm just going to delete that because I obviously already have an audio player inside of my repeating group. But the very last thing I need to run you through is how we can build out our workflow that's obviously going to get us to this point where we can play an audio file. So if I double click on my generate audio text here, I'm going to choose to edit a workflow. Now I've already created this workflow from scratch, but what I could do is just delete all of these steps here so I can walk you through the process once again. Now, thankfully, when it comes to this workflow, there's only a few steps we need to add in. And the very first step is going to be under our plugins actions here. So what you'll now see is the API call that we've created. So the OpenAI text to speech. And within this workflow step, what you'll see is the ability to add in the text that we want to send through to this model. So by default, it's pulling the dummy text that I added in when we initialized that API call. So it says this is test text. Whereas what I'd like to do is insert dynamic data and just reference the text that someone has typed into that multi-line input field on my page. So I'm just going to type in the word multi and reference the multi-line input text, its value. And that's all we need to select here. Then from here, what we need to do is create a new AI audio file in our database. So after OpenAI generates that text into an audio file, it's going to return a value. We'll need to store that in our database. So under the data tab, I'm going to choose to create a new thing. The type of thing I'll create is an AI audio. And all I need to do is match the relevant fields to the information from our API call. So for the audio file, this is going to be the result of step 1. And that, of course, is where OpenAI has generated an audio file. We're going to grab the URL of that audio file. And then for the text, this is once again just going to be the value stored within our multi-line input. So I'm going to choose its value there. And then finally, just a personal preference of mine is that I'm going to add an additional step within my workflow. And I'm just going to choose to reset the relevant input fields. So that way the multi-line input field on my page resets as soon as it generates audio. Now look, at this point in time, you would have a fully functional model. So what I'm going to do is run a preview of my app here. And I'm just going to type in some text. So I'm going to say this is more test text that needs to be transcribed. Now at this point, we haven't yet built out the feature to select which particular AI voice a user can choose from, but by default, it's just going to use the standard voice we added when we initialized the API call. So I'm going to choose to generate this audio here. It's going to run that workflow. It's going to send that text through to OpenAI, which is then going to return an audio file. And when I hit play here,
This is more test text that needs to be transcribed.
this is in fact more test text that needs to be transcribed. So as you can see, we have a fully functional feature. But if you wanted to stick around and learn how you can allow your users to choose from any of the AI voices that OpenAI provides, I'm just going to cover this within the next couple of minutes here. But before we do that, I just want to jump back to my Notion checklist and tick off that I've shown you how we could obviously build out the interface for my demo app, how we could build out the workflows, and particularly I just took a bit of time to explain how we could format that HTML audio player. But now what we're going to do is create that feature that allows someone to select from an AI voice. So if we jump back into OpenAI's documentation, right down the bottom of this page, we obviously have all of the voice options. So there's Alloy, Echo, Fable, Onyx, Nova, and Shimmer. And if you wanted to change the value of these manually, all you'd need to do is just jump into your Bubble app, open up your plugins tab, and under the voice parameter for the API call, you just need to type in the name of the voice you want to use. But one thing I do need to highlight is that as you can see in the documentation here, you do need to spell each option in all lowercase letters. If you spell it starting with an uppercase letter, you're going to get an error message. But let's say you want to use the Echo voice. All you'd need to do is jump back into Bubble and replace Alloy with Echo. But that doesn't allow our users to actually choose which voice they want. And so how can we allow them to do that? What we can do is add in yet another dynamic parameter. So we're actually going to remove the text echo. I'm going to add an open triangle bracket, and I'm going to type in the word voice. So voice is now the name of that parameter. And as you'll see, it's going to add a new value that I can determine inside of my API call. And for an example, all I need to do is just type in one of the voices here. So I could just type in Alloy because that's the first option. And as I mentioned before, we're going to need to type that out in all lowercase letters. Now, if I reinitialize this call, I can see that was successful. If you really wanted, you could run a preview of this, but I don't want to. Instead, what I'd like to do is build out a drop-down menu on my page, as I've already done, that just allows our end users to select from all of the voice options. Now, you could in theory just add a drop-down and display a list of static choices, but today I've just opted to create a list of option sets instead. So within my data tab, I've gone into my option sets menu. I've created a new option set called AI voices. And look, I've just typed in all of the options as individual options. Now look, I'm not going to teach you what option sets are. If you don't know what they are, please watch another tutorial on that. I do have an existing video, but I do think this is pretty self-explanatory. You just need to type every option out. And as I mentioned before, please make sure you type them out in all lowercase letters. Then if we jump back to our design tab, what I'm going to do is add a new drop-down menu on my page so I can show you how I've set this up. Now within this drop-down menu, I'm going to reference a list of dynamic choices. So a list of options that already exist in my database. For the type of choices, I'm going to reference the AI voices option sets. For the choices source, I'll select all of the AI voices. And for the caption, it'll just be the current options display. That's super straightforward. I'm going to then delete that drop-down menu, double click on my generate audio button and choose to edit the workflow that sends this API call. And if I was to select on step 1, what I can see is that my dynamic parameter is not available. And I do have a hunch as to why that's the case. Over in my plugins tab here, I can see that I've marked this as private. Whereas what I need to do is uncheck that, jump back to my workflows tab, and now you'll see the option to add in the name of the AI voice that we want. So I'm going to choose to remove the static text. I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to reference the option from the drop-down AI voice, which is the drop-down that I created, and I'm just going to reference its display text. Then from here, if I was to run another preview of my page, all I'll need to do is type in some new text, and look, I'm going to paste in the text I used at the start of this tutorial, which is arguably just some of the best AI-generated text in all of time. Can we take a quick moment to just thank YouTube ads for reminding us that Grammarly exists at least 3 times a day? Then from here, I'm going to select my AI voice. Now I'm going to select Nova. I'm going to choose to generate that audio. It's going to obviously send that through to our API endpoint. It's going to then convert that text into audio, and if we scroll on down, I'll now have the option to play that out.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct.
Yes, it is grammatically correct. But look, thankfully that is everything I needed to cover inside of this tutorial today. Look, I know it dragged on for a little bit, but I truly wanted to make sure I didn't leave any stone unturned. I wanted to make sure I walked through every single step in as much detail as I could. So after building that last feature out, we're just going to jump back into our Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished adding the ability for our users to be able to select their AI voice of preference. And just like that, you now know how to create your very own text-to-speech model using both OpenAI and Bubble. Today, I'd only just highlighted one use case, but look, the possibilities are absolutely endless from here. If you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources I share, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel, so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new tutorial. In the meantime, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this specific video, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.